President.
The senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would ask to dispense with the calling of the quorum.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise in strong opposition to the nomination of Congressman Mick Mulvaney to be the Director of the Office of Management and Budget. Based on his appearance before the Senate Budget and Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, he appears to be a smart and articulate individual, but after examining his record and his testimony, I believe he lacks the fundamental judgment to serve in this important role. Mr. Mulvaney's tenure as a member of Congress has been one marked by symbolic stands and stunts that have been most successful in generating bipartisan opposition rather than support. Until now, it has mattered little whether his proposals have been motivated by firmly held principles or other motives. We have just been fortunate that few of Mr. Mulvaney's ideas have been made into law. However, with an appointment to the position of real authority at OMB, Mr. Mulvaney will have great power to put his ideas into practice. For that reason, it is worth reflecting on the positions he has taken. At times of national fiscal and economic turmoil, Congressman Mulvaney could consistently be found among those stoking the flames of pandemonium in order to advance a partisan or ideological point. Indeed, he was among those Republican members of the Congress who cheered efforts to force the country to default on our financial obligations in 2011, dismissing the domestic and global alarm over Republican brinkmanship as fear-mongering and as promoting a fabricated crisis. In 2013, he voted to support the Republican shutdown of the federal government, which ultimately cost American taxpayers $2 billion in back wages for federal workers who were locked out of their jobs. In addition to this and other fiscal waste, the 16-day shutdown hurt the economy. Moody's estimated that it cut real GDP by $20 billion, shaving half a percentage point of growth off the fourth quarter of 2013. In 2015, Mr. Mulvaney was part of another Republican shutdown effort. This time it was to shutter the Department of Homeland Security to protest President Obama's immigration policy. Thankfully, House Republicans relented before shutdown took effect. Otherwise, the closure would have caused about 30,000 furloughs and about 200,000 other people, including Coast Guard personnel, TSA, ICE, Border Patrol, and Customs officers, to report to work, most of them without the promise of a paycheck. When Americans have suffered natural disasters, Mr. Mulvaney has shown himself to be among those who are the least sympathetic about providing federal assistance, insisting, for example, that emergency aid for the victims of Hurricane Sandy should be offset. He has at least been consistent in this regard, since he voted against similar aid to his home state of South Carolina. Of course, his opposition in that instance was mainly symbolic because it was a foregone conclusion that the bill would pass. But this should give every American pause. Mr. Mulvaney's record of supporting brinksmanship and his responses to written questions show that his first instinct will be to use any one-time emergency as an opportunity to force lasting budgetary cuts. I'm also concerned about Mr. Mulvaney's intentions with regard to the elimination of the sequester-level budget caps. In 2013, with sequester cuts on the horizon, Mr. Mulvaney ruled out revenue increases or scaling back the sequester. He said, in his words, "We want to keep the sequester in place and take the cuts we can get." As the nominee to be OMB director, Mr. Mulvaney now believes, like President Trump, that the sequester cap should be lifted for defense, but he has made no allowance for non-defense discretionary programs and agencies, including the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security. Mr. Mulvaney has thus far failed to grasp that there is simply no way to secure support for sequestration relief without addressing both defense and non-defense sides of the ledger. Moreover, he has not recognized that it is repugnant to many here to suggest that one side of the budget can be cannibalized to fund the other side. The best way to fund sequester relief is through the proven combination of additional revenue and reasonable cuts. It has worked before, and we should look to that solution again. We should also reject efforts to use overseas contingency operations accounts, or OCO funding, to fill the gap when it comes to defense spending. It is not a legitimate tool to fix this question. Despite my many disagreements with Mr. Mulvaney, this is one point where we do appear to see roughly eye to eye in terms of using the OCO accounts for those overseas contingencies they were designed to fund. Where we disagree most vehemently is on the value of core programs that help Americans lift themselves up so they can participate fully in our economy and society. Although he has recently changed his position, Mr. Mulvaney, as a state legislator, voted for legislation that questions the constitutionality of Medicaid and Social Security. And today he still questions the constitutionality of federal involvement in education. This is more than a philosophical stand. His position will color how the administration invests in schools and students over the next 4 years. I'm especially disturbed that Mr. Mulvaney isn't even willing to commit to protect funding for the Pell Grant program and to reducing college debt, a burden faced by students and their families all across this country. I've also been disturbed by Mr. Mulvaney's cavalier position about benefit cuts to Social Security and Medicare by such measures as increasing the retirement age. Now, let's be clear. When you force a person to wait 2 or 3 more years to begin collecting the full benefits that they have earned, it is a cut. And if poor health or lack of job prospects force a person to begin collecting benefits before reaching the normal retirement age, he or she will see a significant reduction in monthly benefits. These cuts fall heaviest on the most vulnerable, low-income workers and workers in the most physically demanding jobs, those who simply cannot continue to work for another few years. We can make changes to sustain these programs without the deep cuts to benefits that Mr. Mulvaney would promote. In this one area, I would hope that the president could prevail over his staff. Many times during the campaign, President Trump promised to protect Social Security and Medicare. In fact, last March he said, "It's my absolute intention to leave Social Security the way it is, not increase the age, and to leave it as it is." It remains to be seen how sincere the president is on this issue. Last month, he was effectively rebuffed by 49 Republicans who voted successfully to kill Senator Sanders' amendment to create a point of order that would prevent the Senate from breaking President Trump's promise that, quote, "there will be no cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid." Unfortunately, the president said nothing about this vote, which should lead all Americans to ask how committed he is to his promise. His choice of Mr. Mulvaney's also leaves me concerned that he is not sincere about this promise, since Mr. Mulvaney seems clearly intent on making cuts to these vital programs. Mr. Mulvaney has also proven himself unsympathetic to the challenges facing working men and women of this country. He has sponsored legislation to bar the federal government from requiring project labor agreements. He has voted to repeal Davis-Bacon prevailing wage requirements, and he has co-sponsored legislation to undermine the ability of workers to collectively bargain. Moreover, Mr. Mulvaney failed to pay more than $15,000 in unemployment and FICA taxes for a household employee between 2000 and 2004, only making good on that obligation during his nomination process. Even if this could be characterized as an oversight, it is worth noting that Mr. Mulvaney has previously proposed legislation to bar tax delinquents from serving in elective office in South Carolina and to authorize supervisors of federal employees to take punitive action against workers who have failed to pay taxes. One wonders how Mr. Mulvaney would feel about the fitness of a Democratic nominee with a similar challenge. Finally, Mr. President, let me say a few words about Mr. Mulvaney's laissez-faire approach to regulation, particularly the oversight of Wall Street. I believe strongly that the lack of effective regulation, the lack of oversight, and the lack of appropriations for the financial regulatory agencies contributed heavily to the Great Recession. It is why I worked so hard to support the adoption of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, including the creation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Mr. Mulvaney, not surprisingly, takes a different view. As a member of the Financial Services Committee in the House, he said that, quote, "I don't like the fact that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau exists." The CFPB is a consumer-focused agency that has brought nearly $12 billion in refunds and restitution to consumers for Wall Street's abuses. This includes more than $120 million that have been returned to our military families through the efforts of the Bureau's Office of Service Member Affairs, which I worked with Senator Brown of Massachusetts to establish. Because of the Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, working Americans have an advocate in the consumer finance marketplace that is laser-focused on protecting them. Mr. Mulvaney would prefer to transform this agency into a paper tiger that is subject to partisan political pressure and influence from the very industries it is attempting to police. We should not allow him that chance to do that from a perch at OMB. Mr. President, the country has been fortunate that House Republican leadership, with good reason in my view, did not reward Mr. Mulvaney with a position of authority from which he could exercise real control. Unfortunately, the promotion that President Trump has offered would give him great power, power that will ultimately, I believe, be destructive in his hands. And as a result, I urge my colleagues to oppose this nomination. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.